Hello again. My name is Mindy Mandell, and this is a series of videos on Proclus's Elements of Theology. So in this video, I'm going to talk about propositions 196 through 200. And as always, I will link the playlist here for those of you who would like to check some of the past videos. And I am using the E.R. Dodds translation, and as always, there is a link in the description box for a PDF. Alright, well, this video is starting off with a really curious proposition. 196 reads, "Every participated soul makes use of a first body, which is perpetual and has a constitution without temporal origin, and exempt from decay." So this is the first mention of any sort of subtle body. It is consistent, though, with Proclus's principle of a median between two things that are very different. And soul and body, of course, are very different. Therefore, between them, there must be that which is like soul in one respect, but unlike it in another. And this median is what Proclus is here calling a first body. And Proclus begins, "For if every soul is perpetual in respect of its existence, and if further by its very being it directly ensouls some body, then it must ensoul it at all times, since the being of every soul is invariable." Now, ensouling a body perpetually seems counterintuitive, at least from the usual understanding of body as something physical. To follow the logic here, a bit of review might be in order. Proposition 191 actually is the one that introduced the idea of soul being eternal in its existence. And this proposition states, "Every participated soul has an eternal existence, but a temporal activity." The next piece of this puzzle is that it ensouls some body by its very being. I'm going to turn to proposition 188 for this one. This proposition states that every soul is at once a principle of life and a living thing. And we see in the description here, the explanation, that it bestows life upon animate bodies. So here we see that soul animates bodies, and being a principle of life, as we see in the italics, we have seen that principles are self-constituted, and they create by their very being. So Proclus's conclusion is that something eternal and invariable that ensouls a body must do so perpetually. Now we can certainly see the logic of this sentence. It still might be puzzling, though, to consider a body that participates perpetually. So we need to go on to the second sentence. And if we accept that logic, then here's what follows. That which it ensouls is on its part ensouled at all times, and at all times participates life. And what lives at all times, a fortiori, exists at all times. I'm going to pause here for just a moment. So things that exist may not necessarily live, but anything that lives must exist. Therefore, being is prior to life. Okay, going on, what exists at all times is perpetual. Therefore, a body directly ensouled and directly attached to any soul is perpetual. So this is a clever argument here. Soul must have a perpetual vehicle, some body that is not temporary, but that always carries it. But every participated soul is directly participated by some body, inasmuch as it is participated and not unparticipated, and by its very being ensouls the participant. And so Proclus is reiterating the logic from the first sentence, tying into it what he added in the second. And so here is his conclusion. Accordingly, every participated soul makes use of a first body, which is perpetual, and in respect of its existence, is without temporal origin or decay. Okay, going on to Proposition 197. Every soul is a vital and cognitive substance, or ousia, a substantial and cognitive principle of life, and a principle of knowledge as being a substance and a life principle. And all these characters coexist in it, the substantial, the vital, and the cognitive, all in all, and each severally. Okay, there's a lot going on here. First, a note on the Greek. Wherever you see substance or substantial, you have some grammatical form of ousia. And where you see cognitive or knowledge, you have some grammatical form of gnosis. And gnosis is a higher, more unific form of knowledge, beyond subject and object. It's sometimes translated as intuitive knowledge. Now this proposition, much like propositions 194 and 195 in my last video, it really highlights the majesty of soul. Okay, that said, I'm going to go on now to the explanation. For if soul is intermediate between the indivisible forms, or the eidos, and those which are divided in association with a body, then it is neither indivisible in the same sense as all the intellectual kinds, nor is it divided in the same sense as those assimilated to body. Now, when we talk of the indivisible forms, or I like to call them intellectual realities, when we talk of these extending into the sensory realms, what we call these is usually translated into English as reason principles. And these are what Proclus is referring to here as those which are divided in association with a body. These are basically later progressions of the indivisible realities, extending into the realms of time and space. Now, Proposition 190 is cited here because this one sets up soul as intermediate between the intellectual realities and the reason principles associated with body. And here it is as a reminder that every soul is intermediate between the indivisible principles and those which are divided in association with bodies. And this is what we are seeing here. Accordingly, whereas the substantial, vital, and cognitive principles are in corporeal things disjointed one from another, in souls they exist as a unity, without division and without body. All are together because soul is immaterial, and it has no parts. And so what we are seeing here is that these three principles in the soul are without separation. In the physical world, things are disjointed and they're necessarily separated one from another. But such separation does not exist at the level of soul. All can be together in soul. And Proclus cited Proposition 186. I'm going to take a quick look at that one. And this one simply states that every soul is an incorporeal ousia and separable from body. So after making the case that all are together in soul, Proclus is now going to make the opposite argument. He says again, whereas in the intellectual kinds all exist as a unity, in souls they are distinguished and divided. And Proclus has to make this contrast with intellect because he told us in the first sentence that soul is not indivisible in the same way. And we can see that here in Proposition 176. All the intellectual forms are both implicit, each in each other, should be, and severally existent. And I'm going to scroll down a bit because he gave us this example that I think might be helpful to us now. He says, if in addition to the above proofs, anyone should feel the need of examples, let him consider the theorems which are contained in a single soul. All these, existing in the same unextended substance, are united one to another, since the unextended embraces its content not spatially, but without partition or interval. At the same time, they are mutually distinct, for the soul can produce them all in their purity, bringing out each by itself and drawing forth nothing of the rest in its company. And the soul's activity could not thus discriminate them were they not permanently discriminated in their passive state. And so that's the argument that Proclus made to show that forms, or eidos, in intellect are distinguished as well as being all in all. Discriminations must be possible in intellect in order for those distinctions to exist at the level of soul. And the implication here, of course, is that the distinctions at the level of soul are more pronounced than they are at the level of intellect. That's why we can see it more clearly at the level of soul. All right, so Proclus opened Proposition 197 by showing the unity of soul. Then he highlighted their distinctions. And so now he can reach this conclusion: thus all exist both together and severally. So soul is the median between the eternal and the temporal. Still, the two aspects feel like a contradiction. Proclus needs to connect the points he has made, and he does so in the next sentence. And here he writes, "But if all are together in one, being devoid of parts, they interpenetrate one another. And if they exist severally, they are on the other hand distinct and unconfused, so that each exists by itself, yet all in all." Okay, we have one more paragraph here. Now, this last paragraph is reminiscent of Proposition 103. And I think that if I review that one for a moment first, this paragraph will be a whole lot easier to follow. So Proposition 103 reads, "All things are in all things, but in each according to its proper nature. For in being there is life and intelligence, in life being and intelligence, in intelligence being in life. But each of these exists upon one level intellectually, upon another vitally, and on the third existentially." Okay, this proposition is focused on the intelligible or the unparticipated monads. One thing we have been seeing throughout this work of Proclus's is that there is a certain logos, certain patterns and relationships that repeat at each realm, but it repeats in a way that is proper to each realm. So what Proclus is going to show us in Proposition 197 is that this basic principle, which is applied here in Proposition 103 to the unparticipated monads, also has its proper reflection at the level of soul. Proclus starts off, "For in the substance, or ousia, of soul, life and knowledge are implicit. Otherwise, not every soul will know itself, inasmuch as a lifeless substance is in itself bereft of knowledge." Ousia is really a dynamic triad of existence that is vital and also intellectual. And it may be worth restating here that throughout this proposition, knowledge is the Greek word gnosis, which is also the word used, by the way, in the Delphic maxim, "Know thyself." Again, it's an intuitive, unific knowledge, knowledge beyond subject and object. And in its life are implicit substance and knowledge. For a non-substantial life and one devoid of knowledge are proper only to lives involved in matter, which cannot know themselves and are not pure substances. Right, so you can see a lot of similarities to Proposition 103. And finally, a knowledge without substance or life would be non-existent. For all knowledge implies a living knower, which is in itself possessed of substance. And so there at the level of intellect, we are seeing that there's no separation of subject and object. There's that turning on itself, knowing itself. And reminiscent of Proposition 103, we are seeing at the level of soul that all are in all, but each according to its own proper nature. All right, we're going to switch gears now for Proposition 198. This one reads, all that participates time, but has perpetuity of movement, is measured by periods. So here we are looking at that which is perpetual throughout the whole of time, as opposed to the eternal, which is a simultaneous whole that is beyond time. Now this proposition we're going to see builds on propositions 54 and 55. In fact, you can see 54 mentioned here. So I want to review these two before jumping to the explanation. All right, so first, Proposition 54 sets up the eternal and the temporal. Every eternity is a measure of things eternal, and every time of things in time. And these two are the only measures of life and movement in things. And then Proposition 55 divides things that are temporal into that which is perpetual and that which has a dated existence in a part of time. And so that gives us the eternal, the perpetual, and the finite temporal. All right, so the proposition started with the words, all that participates time. Therefore, that's what we're considering. And so in the explanation, he can start, because it participates time, its movement has the character of measure and finitude, as we saw in Proposition 54. And its path is determined by a numerical principle. And because it moves perpetually with a perpetuity that is not eternal but temporal, he concludes that it must move in periods. So here, Proclus has set up that its movement has no beginning and no end, but it moves throughout the whole of time rather than as a simultaneous whole. And that is the meaning of being perpetual. And so his conclusion is that it must move in periods. We need to see more clearly what this means. For movement is a change from one set of conditions to another, and the sum of things is finite, both in number and in magnitude. And the sum being finite, it is not possible that change should proceed in an infinite straight line, but neither can anything perpetually in motion pass through a finite number of changes. So what he is saying here is that the physical universe is finite, and so he has to consider how soul can move through a finite universe while perpetually in motion. And I just want to step away for a moment to remind you of the notion of relative infinity. That all infinitude in things which have being is infinite neither to the superior orders nor to itself. For whomsoever anything is infinite, to him it is also uncircumscribed. But he goes on to say that containing and determining itself as it does, it cannot be infinite for itself, and still less for those above it, since it possesses but a parcel of the infinitude which is in them. And so in other words, we may look at the universe and think that the physical world is infinite, but to the realm of soul, relative to the realm of soul, the realm of matter is not infinite, it is finite. And so coming back to Proposition 198, here is Proclus's conclusion. What moves perpetually will return to its starting point, so as to constitute a period. So what Proclus is giving us is a circular pattern. This allows for a finite number of points while also allowing for perpetual motion. Now, some have assigned this proposition to the heavenly bodies, but assigning perpetuity to anything physical is something I find problematic. I think it would be more appropriate to assign this to souls and a metaphysical explanation of reincarnation. In the next proposition, Proclus takes this general principle and directly applies it to souls that have their activity in time. Proposition 199 reads, every intramundane soul has its proper life periods and cyclic reinstatements. The term intramundane soul refers to souls that are functioning within the mundane realm. This could be contrasted with supramundane souls, which oversee the mundane realm. Now, the proof here is basically just one long sentence. I'm going to take it in pieces, and we're going to see that Proclus has pulled together a number of points from various past propositions in order to make his case. So he starts off by telling us that these souls are measured by time and have a transitive activity. And so that's the first piece of the puzzle here, Proposition 191. And this is the proposition that states that participated soul has a temporal activity. So the soul's activity is in time. The next step is that movement is soul's distinctive character. And we saw this in Proposition 20. And here I'm going to focus just on the part in yellow. When soul is present, the body is in some sense self-moved, but not when the soul is absent. And this shows that body is naturally moved from without or from outside, while self-movement is of the soul's essence. And so this shows that movement is the soul's distinctive character. And so now to these 2 points, Proclus is going to tie in the point that he ended with in Proposition 198. All that moves and participates time, if it be perpetual, moves in periods, and it periodically returns in a circle and is restored to its starting point. So we have 3 pieces to this proof. Soul has an activity measured by time, movement is its distinctive character, and it moves in circular periods. So now Proclus is going to state what follows from all of this. Then it is evident that every intramundane soul, having movement and exercising a temporal activity, will have a periodic motion and also cyclic reinstatements, since in the case of things perpetual, every period ends in a reinstatement of the original condition. And a cyclic reinstatement simply means that the cycle starts over. That sounds to me very much like the soul taking on another physical vehicle and experiencing another cycle. So in other words, it reincarnates. All right, and finally, Proposition 200. Every psychic period is measured by time, but while the periods of the other souls are measured by some particular time, that of the first soul measured by time has the whole of time for measure. The basic meaning here is that soul as a whole is perpetual, and so it has only one cycle, which is equal to the whole of time. But all other souls are going to move in multiple cycles. Well, now for his proof of the statement, Proclus starts with proposition 54. I'm not going to go back to that one because I already reviewed it earlier in this video. But that's the one that states that time and eternity are the only two measures of movement and life. So with that in mind, I'm going to jump now into the proof. For if all movements involve an earlier and a later, then periodic movements do so. Hence, they participate time, and time is the measure of all psychic periods. And Proclus goes on, if all souls had the same period and they traversed the same course, then all would occupy the same time. But if their reinstatements do not coincide, they vary also in the periodic times which bring about the reinstatements. So we have these two possibilities. Either all souls start and stop at the same time, or they start and stop at varying points in time. Okay, in the next paragraph, Proclus now is going to turn to soul that is the whole in which all souls participate. This soul must be perpetual throughout the whole of time. Now it is evident that the soul with which temporal measurement begins has the whole of time for measure. For if time is the measure of all movement, then the first mobile principle will participate the whole of time and be measured by time in its entirety. Since if the sum total of time do not measure its primal participant, it cannot as a whole measure any other. So time must be able to measure the whole, or it wouldn't be able to measure any of the parts. Now Dodd cites proposition 50 to show that time is indeed the measure of all movement. And proposition 50 reads, all that is measured by time, either in its existence or in its activity, is in process of coming to be, in that respect in which it is measured by time. And in the explanation, he's talking about things here that have an earlier and a later, and says, if then its past and its future are distinct, it is something which becomes and never is, but it moves with the movement of the time which measures it. And so there we see that time is what measures the movement of things that are not eternal. Things that are eternal, by the way, you see in the other italics, the other yellow there. Accordingly, it does not exist as a simultaneous whole. That which is eternal is as a simultaneous whole that is outside of time. Okay, coming back now to proposition 200. We saw here that Proclus started by looking at all souls. Then in the second paragraph, he focused only on what we might call the world soul, or soul as a whole. Now in the third paragraph, he's going to shift to looking at all of the other souls that are subsequent to the whole. And this starts off, and that all other souls are measured by certain measures less universal than the whole of time, is apparent from the above. For if they are less universal than the soul which primitively participates time, it follows that they cannot make their periods coextensive with time in its entirety. So there's the contrast between the whole and the participants. All souls move through periods, but the whole soul has a period that equals the whole of time. Subsequent souls do not. This is why they have reinstatements. Their many cyclic reinstatements will be parts of the single period or reinstatement wherein that soul is reinstated, which is the primal participant of time. So the subsequent souls are parts of the whole. For the more specific participation is proper to the lesser potency, the more universal to the greater. Thus, the other souls lack the capacity to receive the whole of the temporal measure within the limits of a single life, since they have been allotted a station that is subordinate to that of the soul with which temporal measurement begins. The idea, by the way, that which is more universal or general is higher in power goes back to Proposition 60. Whatever principle is the cause of a greater number of effects is superior to that which has a power limited to fewer objects and which gives rise to parts of those existences constituted by the other as wholes. Parts meaning more specific, wholes meaning more general. And then you see in the explanation there, I highlighted a few parts here, that which is more powerful is also more comprehensive. It is the greater and more universal power, and that means that it is near to the cause of all things. And so again, coming back to Proposition 200, we saw that the more specific participation is proper to the lesser potency, the more universal to the greater. And notice here also that what's going on here is that each soul enjoys movement in a manner that fits its proper station. So if you found that helpful, I would appreciate you hitting the like button. That really does help the channel. And also, if you don't already subscribe, I hope you'll think about doing so. And if you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to put those below.